I'm David Slucki. I'm the director of the ACJC, or sometimes when I introduce people these days, to make it a bit simpler, I say I'm the new Mark Baker, which doesn't exactly capture, because no one can be the new Mark Baker, but sort of as a shorthand, that helps. So I want to start, I'm going to do this terribly millennial thing and sort of have my notes on my phone. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, to pay respect to their elders past and present, and to kind of reflect for a moment on what it means to live, work, love and thrive on land that was violently stolen, the land of a people who experienced the worst of colonisation, genocide, forced displacement, loss of families, community, language and culture. And it's a responsibility I take very seriously, and I think as sort of Jewish writers or people writing about Jews, it's something we always ought to keep in mind. I also want to acknowledge the family of Mark Baker, who many of whom are here. Mark's mother Genya, his children Gabe and Sarah and Charlotte, Rachel and Josh are in New York, so they're not here, and all of Mark's nephews, nieces, cousins, and also just everyone who was close to Mark and touched by him and felt close to him. So I'm really honoured to be moderating this session. I'm just going to give a little quick intro and then I'll introduce each of our speakers. It's a bit of a longer session than the others, and it's something that we're really sort of excited to be able to honour Mark's legacy. And, you know, I want to thank Jewish Book Week and to Deb, the director, for giving us this space to really, give Mark the due he deserves. So I'm really honoured personally. For 5 very formative years, Mark was my boss. He was my teacher and my mentor. And in the spirit of Mark, I don't think we should shy away from difficult conversation. So in terms of acknowledging things, I also just want to acknowledge that this discussion's taking place during an immensely difficult period through, violence that we're witnessing in Israel-Palestine. Whatever our position on the causes, course or aftermath of the current conflict, I do want to acknowledge that we're all watching it with immense distress and pain and anguish, and I want to encourage that. Oh, we're getting extra chairs, thank you. And I want to encourage everyone to sort of approach conversations with the recognition that that's where we're all coming from. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I learned from Mark in that period under his mentorship. One thing is that we need, in times like this, more compassion, not less. We need more listening, more humanity, more time sitting with things that make us uncomfortable. Mark taught me and many of us that we need to be brave, bold, and have the courage of our convictions. And one thing as a PhD student and then a staff member at ACJC, Mark always was courageous and always with humanity. I learned from Mark that we can sit together with people with whom we disagree. We can sit in discomfort. We can engage in ideas that are opposite to our own, and still see the humanity of the person sitting opposite us. And we can engage people in good faith and not with suspicion. I first met Mark when I was a PhD student at Melbourne Uni, and I was a young sort of firebrand lefty, and I was in my mid-20s, and like many people who've encountered Mark for the first time, we disagreed on a lot of things. And I think that's why Mark liked having me teach with him and having me in his sphere at that time. And why ultimately he encouraged me to join ACJC as a PhD student, because he wanted to surround himself, I think, with people with whom he disagreed and people he could have an intellectually lively conversation with, not just people with whom he agreed. And that's what the ACJC was like when I first went there 16 or 17 years ago now. It was surrounded with people who didn't all agree with each other, who weren't just like him. You know, I remember teaching the Arab-Israeli conflict with Mark. That was when I first met him. And our teaching team would have long and lively arguments about the course material. And, you know, you all remember the cheeky grin that Mark would get when he saw that things were going a particular way. And that was something that I probably didn't appreciate at the time. But now sort of occupying Mark's seat, literally in his office at Monash Caulfield, I really do appreciate all that I learned from Mark about how to navigate difficult conversations, how to navigate a very complex community, how to navigate a bureaucracy, and how to do it all with chutzpah, good humour, and goodwill. And so, you know, I just wanted to sort of frame this because we're going to talk today about Mark's literary legacy. But, you know, we at ACJC, we're still grieving the loss of Mark and the indelible mark that he left on us as a community. And we want to continue to honour his memory and what he left us all. So, without any further ado, what we're here to do is to talk about Mark's books, which you can see here, and the incredible literary legacy that he has left us and continues to leave us with a new book about to come out. So we're going to sort of do it in chronological order and sort of reflect on each book in order and its impact. So I want to start by, and I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak rather than everyone at once. So we're going to go through that, and then I'm going to invite Michelle, Lesh and Raimond Gaita to come and read from the new memoir. So Krystiyna Duszniak is the owner of Lost Histories, a Polish Jewish research bureau. She has an MA in history from the University of Melbourne, where she was a student of Mark's and later went on to be his research assistant for the 50th Gate. Lost Histories was born thanks to Mark sending everyone Krystiyna's way when they asked him for similar research for their parents as he'd done for his. Krystiyna worked with Mark whenever she was needed. He was not only her mentor, but her lifelong friend, and not a day goes by when she doesn't miss him. And I just want to add really quickly that when I studied the Holocaust at Melbourne Uni in 2000 and something, a long time ago, Krystiyna was my lecturer, and it's just another example of like the cascading of Mark's legacy that Mark taught Krystiyna, who taught me, and now I teach the Holocaust. So without further ado, Krystiyna Duszniak, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Is this working? Is this working? Can everyone hear me? Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today, Michelle and Ray especially. I'm very moved that you did so because it's true, I miss Mark every single day. And my life will never be the same without him, as I'm sure for many, many, many others. I wanted to start off by telling you all about Generation. I worked at Generation Journal for the last 5 years of its 11-year existence. For those who are not familiar with it, its full title was A Journal of Australian Jewish Life, Thought and Community, later shortened to simply Jewish Life. It is available online thanks to Mark's superhuman efforts before his death. From the outset, working at Generation was, like working on anything with Mark, exhilarating. I started off doing admin, which I took over slowly from the incomparable Salma Sekno. I slowly began editing and organising, hence my title in the later issues as Managing Editor. The Generation office was firstly located at Beth Weitzman. Then, because Mark found that too stuffy, we moved to rooms above the Classic Cinema and finally to Carlisle Street above where Dorovich Pathology is. I was the only non-Jew working at these offices amongst the incredible executive editors the journal had over the years. Yvonne Fine, Sidra Krantz-Moshinsky, Gabby Wenig, the ever-reliable Rosloff as subscriptions manager, Eva Migdal as arts manager, and countless others like Karen Baker, who was brilliant at sourcing artists for us. There were so many others, too numerous to mention here, and so many writers, poets, artists, cartoonists, photographers whose brilliance Mark saw and nurtured, and who today are well known, some even famous. There were also graphic designers Mark picked up on his travels all over Melbourne. You can tell how they varied with the changing look of generation over the years. Mark loved beautiful things, and by the end of its life, Generation was a work of art in and of itself. It had evolved from its aesthetic limitations as a desktop published journal in its early years to a stunningly produced visual feast by its end. And the topics it covered were so diverse that in its last years it contained both academic discourse and half-flippant comedy sketches. It asked questions about Jewish life in contemporary Australia, but always drew on what had come before. And in that, it was always and consistently a reflection of Jewish experience. Mark wrote many articles for the journal, and you can see the evolution of his intellect over the years reflected there. I encourage you to read it online and see for yourself how truly cutting edge it was. But the practicality of getting it together was not without its frustrations. We who worked on Generation all felt the same frustration at different times. Mark was either not there, or when he was there, he was on the phone, or he wanted to meet at a cafe, not at the office, where he'd become distracted by gossip, or he wouldn't return our calls, or he was evasive and non-committal about deadlines. It drove us slightly crazy. But of course, when he was truly there in the moment, wherever we met, when he sourced brilliant people to contribute to Generation, when he had countless meetings with potential or existing benefactors to try to keep the journal afloat, we knew it could only be him at the centre, and he was the reason Generation continued for over 10 years, against all odds. It was his brilliance and charisma that people gravitated to. They wanted to be a part of it because he was at its centre. And he worried enormously about the journal. He contributed his own money to it several times when there was no alternative. He did not want to give up on it, and he fought passionately for its last few years to keep it afloat. In the last issue of October 2000, there is no inkling in Mark's editorial that the journal would cease to publish. He never wanted it to end, but it became inevitable. I remembered on the way here that we actually got robbed. Our officers got robbed after that last issue was published, and all the equipment was taken, and I don't think we had any insurance, and there was no money left. And then the internet age came upon us, and Mark became obsessed with what he called jewishminds.com, one of a series of educational websites he hoped to launch that year. He was also consumed by other projects, such as his own photography, which he told me in his last weeks would also be available online one day. When I look back at the years of Generation's existence, I realise that it began in 1989, which was the year I first met Mark. In the decade that followed, he'd become the inaugural lecturer of modern Jewish history at the University of Melbourne. He finished his PhD. He wrote and published the 50th Gate. No wonder he was preoccupied, difficult to get a hold of, challenging to work with. It's astonishing to consider how much he accomplished in this decade of his 30s. This brings me to his masterpiece, the 50th Gate. There are so many complex threads in the book, and in the light of the tragedies that befell his family and him after it, it is a harrowing read. The book is at once a reflection of his own life, an account of his parents' ordeals during the Holocaust, a memorial to his ancestors, a roadmap to modern Jewish history. It's funny, smart, self-deprecating and devastating. Mark spent months interviewing and re-interviewing his parents in the book, and these interviews and the honesty with which they are presented are the foundation of the work. The Polish research for the book happened almost by accident. I'd been in Poland for a year already doing research for my PhD. I met with Mark and his parents when they came to Poland and showed them around the towns of his parents' childhoods. I'd planned to go home to Australia soon, but Mark asked me to stay on as his research assistant, which I happily accepted. In the course of the next year in Poland, I unearthed many documents for Yossel Becker-Mashin, Mark's father, and his family, which was a matter of good luck more than anything else. The various war fronts had never passed through Wierzbnik, Yossel's town, and most of its archives had survived, so we ended up with a stupendous array of records, which included births, deaths, marriages, going back to the beginning of the 19th century, school reports, wartime Judenrat and Nazi documentation, and testimonies of witnesses. I remember the excitement with which I reported my findings to Mark through long and expensive phone calls or via fax machines wherever I could find them. Mark insisted I fax through the documents and often also their translations. He needed to see them for himself before he in turn called his parents and reported it all back to them. He had great fun with Jossel's report cards, which had the word niedostateczny, unsatisfactory, against the subject of Polish. He jokingly mocked Jossel for it, who came from a traditional Yiddish-speaking family and never spoke Polish except at school and wasn't particularly interested in it anyway. The 50th Gate's lightest and perhaps almost most loving moments are the exchanges between Mark and his parents, or between Mark's parents themselves, as Genia, his mother, taunts her husband for not speaking the perfect Polish she does. When we found Mark's father's birth certificate in Poland, it showed him to be 2 years older than the family thought he was. I remember Mark's grappling with whether to reveal this to Jossel, articulated in the book as follows: "Dare I tell him his age? Who am I, his son, to measure time for him?" Mark did finally tell his father, but regretted doing so. The book laments these 2 vanished years, while at the same time explaining the possible reason for the mistake by Jossel himself. In Auschwitz, to make himself younger, he told the doctor he was born in 1929 and was thus put into the line headed for life. In Buchenwald, he told them he was born in 1926 to avoid the children's section of the camp. Post-war, he told the International Refugee Organisation 1929, which granted him a child's visa to Switzerland. Mark's mother, Genia, née Krochmal, was born in Bolshovce, a town in Ukraine today, for which very few Jewish records survived. What I found in Ukrainian archives and elsewhere were fragments, but no birth certificate for Genia, or marriage of her parents, or anything else of substance for her family in the interwar period. Mark was frustrated by this, but ultimately he allows the details of his mother's story to be told by Genia herself in her searing testimony, which to his credit Mark's prints word for word. The 50th Gate thus becomes an uneasy journey into Genia's experiences, which she'd never told her boys about in detail before. Unlike Jossel, whose past was shared by other survivors, Genia's survival is unique, and she was just a child when she was hidden by a Polish family in their cellar. The piecing together of her disparate memories is one of the greatest triumphs of the book. But Mark being Mark, he did not let Genia off easily. When he insists on more detail in his book, in his quest to try to find a possible half-sibling born to Genia during the war, when he questions his mother's version of events to fit another story of another child born nearby but in different circumstances, Genia exclaims, "Don't steal my memory," or "Don't interrogate me. I'm your mother, not your prisoner." These exchanges between mother and son are some of the book's most profound revelations. "For God's sake, who do you think you are?" Genia says to Mark. "The people's investigator? What does it matter now? Maybe you should ring Herr Mueller, the SS man who was in charge of overseeing Jewish deportations in the region, and ask him, Entschuldigung, excuse me, do you know when my mother was born or when my uncle was killed?" It is thus ultimately Genia's own recollection that memorialises her suffering, the loss of her brother, the miraculous survival of her mother, who jumped 3 times from different trains headed for the death camp of Belzec, and then her mother's shocking death in post-war Berlin because of a drunken driver. And it is Genia's words above all others that commemorate the losses of her people from what Mark calls her obscure shtetl. Over the year I was his researcher in Poland, my work for Mark took place in so many different archives, but none of it was as effective as Mark's own methods of uncovering history and memory. When trying to find his possible long-lost aunt, for example, and when none of my interviews had yielded results except for vague references to the family now possibly living in Szczecin, Mark jumped on a plane from Israel and we drove straight to Szczecin, where, by use of the pre-internet sources of phone books and telephone directories, we found several families from the same place as Genia had hidden during the war. The child herself was not found, but it was not for want of Mark's doing everything in his power to locate her. It was this urgency, this intensity, this sense that nothing else was more pressing at this time that carried Mark through all the important endeavours of his life. He writes in The 50th Gate, "Sometimes I think that if I were granted the time before I die, I would burn all my private papers. I would prefer to leave the idea of me rather than bits and pieces." But how lucky we are that today we have so many different bits and pieces of Mark, so much more than just the idea of him, that he left us with so many of his writings, from his books, 2 of which are still to be published, to his articles, to his social media posts, and even his emails and messages to friends. This is all some consolation in the face of his loss to the world. How lucky am I that after the 50th Gate was published, Mark got so many inquiries from people also wanting to find documents about their parents that he put them all onto me, and that my small bureau, Lost Histories, was born, thanks to this. As I continue to be astounded by the uniqueness of each person's story, of the complexities and secrets and anguishes of most families, my life is richer for it, and thus Mark lives on in this way, as he does in thousands of others.
After that. Okay. Is this on? No. Sorry. This one? Yeah. Okay. Next, I'd like to introduce Sarah Krasnostein, who is a multi-award-winning writer and critic. She's the best-selling author of the absolutely astonishing The Trauma Cleaner and The Believer, the quarterly essay Not Waving Drowning, and On Peter Carey. They're all in the book room, the bookshop back there if you want to pick up copies. She holds a doctorate in criminal law and is admitted to legal practice in Australia and America. Her awards include the Victorian Prize for Literature, the Australian Book Industry Award for Non-Fiction, and the Walkley's Pascal Prize for Arts Criticism. She's a regular contributor to The Monthly and the Saturday Paper, and she'll talk more about the 50th Gate.
Can you hear me? Is this it's on? Okay. All right. Memory is circular, Mark Baker wrote in the introduction to the 20th anniversary edition of the 50th Gate. That was 2017. Memory is circular, and in its circularity connects to other stories that have unfolded in the past 2 decades since the publication of this book. It is up to us, he continued, to find ways of bringing light into the dark places of the world, be it Cambodia, Rwanda, Srebrenica, Darfur, Syria, and to find new understandings of what lies behind that most mysterious of gates where all of us inhabit the one room. I'm here to talk about fact and fiction in the 50th Gate, and it's a testament to that book's enduring greatness that everything that can be said on that specific topic applies equally to the universal human experience of meaning-making. It's also a testament to the book that it Sorry, is there an echo? Can you? Or is that just me? Is it okay?
It's okay.
It's okay. Okay. It is also a testament to the book that it defies genre. Like its author, its concerns are too universal, its hard-won insights are too personal, and the form of their expression is too authentic and original to fit into the oversimplified demands of a predetermined, one-size-fits-all, externally policed identity. At the same time, it's true that our vocation is also a trade, and that in the book industry, genre matters. So I'm going to say a few words to locate this book in the publishing landscape. The 50th Gate can variously be described as memoir, biography, autobiography, and history. All are forms of nonfiction. When factual material, for example, archival sources, quantitative data, qualitative data like interviews and direct observation, is presented using the techniques traditionally associated with fiction, so dialogue, dramatic scene description, and changes of the author's perspective, we call that particular form of factual writing narrative or creative nonfiction. It doesn't mean that you get to be creative with the facts. It means you are creative with the form of their expression and communication. As writers of creative nonfiction, the contract that we uphold with our readers is this: everything I tell you is true. Some of us, however, reserve the right to go off the path of strict traditional verification and even into the realm of imagination at the service of truth. But when we do so honestly, and we signal to the reader when that's happening. And yet, there are critics and authors who will tell you that regardless of that frankness or candor, that's always unacceptable, There are some people who say if you even change one single name to protect a source's privacy, you've forever departed from the realm of nonfiction. My personal and professional opinion is that such a militant stance infantilizes readers and impoverishes the genre. I believe that Mark, who made the genre richer and deeper, and whose honesty, integrity, meticulousness, and respect for the reader are evident on every page of this book, would agree. The 50th Gate is a factual book. It is one concerned with history as truth and truth as a conversation between generations and between oneself and others, but as a matter of first principles, as a conversation we have with ourselves. Like the work of Martin Buber, it is this form of encounter with the other person, the other idea, the other part of us yearning for things to be different, which moves the 50th Gate's narrative. Mark talking to each of his parents, Mark talking to the reader, Mark talking to himself. This is conversation as excavation, confrontation, negotiation, and always connection. It is conversation as the means of transcending opposing forces, like fact and fiction, to create something new and better. The facts aid our search for accurate, truthful stories, but alone facts are simply the particulate components which comprise an undifferentiated mountain of information about the past. In the fields of law and psychology, history and biography, we accept the fundamental difference between the facts and the possible stories we can make of them, as well as the ineradicable presence of absence in the form of agreed and insoluble unknowns. In this way, no matter how diligent or careful the writer, all nonfiction is inescapably partial and selective. In the 50th Gate, Mark is always present, reminding us of the filter through which the information is being run, that is his heart and his head. By personalizing the story in this way, he universalizes its concerns. It's a lie to say that being honest about, and more so making use of, our inherent subjectivity pollutes the truthfulness of factual stories when such candidness only increases an author's reliability. And it does so by unlocking the gate, to use Mark's metaphor, to other ways of knowing, the interior dimensions of human experience which breathe life into cold, hard facts. Does history remember more than memory? Mark, the historian, asks himself midway through the book, berating himself for questioning his mother, Genya, once again in an effort at verifying a part of her story. Why am I calling her? He continues. Won't you recognize the shameful truth that I doubted her, that I never believed her, that I only recognize suffering in numbers and lists, and not in the laments and pleas of a human being, of a mother screaming for acknowledgement? Objective rationality, to the extent that it exists, is not the historian's only tool. The interior world of personal memory is its own emotional and psychological truth. So too, our empathetic imagination, that ability we each have to discern the contours of another's devastating personal experience. As Genya says at one point in response to his unrelenting quest for certainty, you read books everywhere, but do you know how it feels? Through the medium of its author, wondering and reporting from the library of Yad Vashem, the library of his family, the library of himself, the 50th Gate draws on the unique powers of both fact and fiction by getting as close as humanly possible to that experience of feeling. Mark achieves that at many different points, but perhaps most strikingly by imagining himself into his grandmother's final moments on the train to Treblinka with two of her children and what happened to them in their final moments of life. Once I had imagined myself on the train with my grandmother and her two daughters, he later explained, I was struck by the limitations of language to portray the terror of their journey. Reading those passages, you can feel the limitations of language, but also their opposite. You see, by calling on every intellectual and emotional resource he possessed, Mark created so many finely rendered moments which evoke the weight and depth of those private and forever lost horrors. This may be the highest form of history writing because it shows us why it matters. And Mark did this by nobly and wisely refusing to reflexively privilege the sterile facts that filmmaker Werner Herzog derisively referred to as the truth of accountants. Apologies to any accountants here, we need you. Refusing to prioritize the truth of accountants over the lived experience of personal, emotional reality. Again, from the 2017 introduction, Mark's words, "As a son and as a historian, I wanted to record my parents' memories while also giving expression to the wider context of murder that can be obscured by survivor narratives. And so I turned not only to their testimonies, but also to archival documents, historical monographs, and eyewitness accounts. I wrote alternative endings to highlight the randomness of life and death. I reconfigured ancient tales of hell, but eventually I hit a dead end, the place where memory ends. This is the point at which I made the leap into fiction, not fiction as fabrication, but as an act of empathy so that I could recreate for my parents the last journey of their murdered families." He did so in a way that paid tribute to the discomforting limits of where one person ends and another begins. In that way, the book illuminates the contours of the mystery that will remain forever locked inside each unique life, and especially those impacted or lost to horror. By drawing on all forms of human knowing, Mark created a text as spacious as the past itself, a room large enough for song lyrics and testimony, poetry, end gas chambers, accounting and dreaming, trauma and redemption, and stories told in many voices, many registers. This is a book which asks us to look again at what we consider to be fact and what we consider to be fiction, an invitation to be curious about our protective assumptions and defenses. Returning to the book for this session, I was struck by its enduring freshness and relevance, and by the sense of its narrative as an ongoing conversation, one that enacts the idea that the 50th gate is not a perfect place, but rather a messy and difficult perpetual process, one which requires us to struggle towards a better accommodation with the past, the present, and also a shared future. That idea is quintessentially Jewish. In my opinion, it's true Torah, and it's also universally human. And it is an idea that has infinite potential to connect us rather than alienate us from each other. In this book and across his output, Mark led by example about what it will take to reach those new understandings of what lies behind that most mysterious of gates where all of us inhabit the one room. And the fact that we're all here today in this room because of him is just one of many indications that he was not wrong.
Playing footsies with the microphones. That was a stunning analysis of 50th Gate. A colleague, just in the last couple of days, reminded me, as well as the literary impact of 50th Gate, has also been the cultural impact in Australia, that more than almost any other book in Australia, the 50th Gate has brought story of the Holocaust to Australians. Through the tens of thousands of copies that it's sold and through it being on the New South Wales curriculum. So, the book is an incredible gift to those of us who see the importance of teaching the Holocaust and spreading awareness of that, as well as its incredible literary importance. Let's move on to our next speaker, Foong Ling Kong. is publisher at Melbourne University Publishing. Over a 2-decade career, she's worked in-house at Penguin, Hardy Grant and Allen and Unwin. She was chair of the Feminist Writers Festival, on the boards of the Stella Prize and Overland, and managing editor of Ann Summers Reports. She spent the last 7 years as editor of Debate at the Parliament of Victoria, where she published the proceedings of the Legislative Assembly until her recent reunification with MUP. And today she's going to talk about the path to publishing 30 Days. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today to discuss Mark's work. And I must say, what a bittersweet pleasure it has been going back over his text messages and email exchanges as I put together my piece for today. I know I will never have another correspondent like Mark, with his quick wit and puckish humor and just the right amount of pathos, who could have texted me the night that Trump beat Hillary in November 2016, and I quote, "The apocalypse seems so obvious in retrospect." Our association began 8 years ago in August 2016, for which we have our friend Dina Kluska to thank. Mark had just completed a manuscript during the Slucki about his wife Karen's death, and he wanted someone outside of his circle to read it to see if it held together, if it was good enough for publication, and to kick it into shape with him, basically. All concerns familiar to many of you in this room of writers who would understand how fragile you feel upon completion of a piece of work and how fraught with uncertainty the path to publication is. He sent me his manuscript, I read it and wrote back a longish email. He crossed the river to the northern Badlands where we met. We talked for hours about the manuscript, about what was working, what could be tweaked, what could be amplified, and then marked the beginning of our editorial conversation and a friendship that would extend beyond the book. We talked a lot about Susan Sontag's idea about all of us being born with dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. We had read The Grief Corpus, Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking and Blue Nights, Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, Max Porter's Grief is the Thing with Feathers, and of course, Siddhartha Mukherjee's Emperor of All Maladies. And we both had experience as carers of partners with cancer. We discussed at length the question of a readership, if there would be a market for the book. In my email, I had warned that publishers can be chary of downbeat books and books about death, but I have confidence, Mark, you'll find someone who'll get the story. There was also the question if a work such as 30 Days was a personal piece of writing that did not have the mainstream appeal that trade publishers require, powerful and compelling as it is, which we'll go into more in a moment. A few elements draw me to the book, of course, to the manuscript. Chief among them is powerful meditation on the nature of love as it evolves over time. I was absolutely captured by Karen saying, "You've come back" in the book, which is so knowing and contains within it all the ups and downs that marriages and relationships are. Or on page 114 where she said, "No one, not even you, knows what's inside here." Or when Mark asks Karen in 30 Days, "Did I deliver on your dreams?" As heartbreaking and as tough a question anyone can ask in a relationship. I thought the conceit of 30 Days worked in a good way. There was great cohesion and momentum to the narrative, which moved along at a great clip, and the cutting back and forth between the past and present versions of Mark and Karen helped readers get a fix on their life. There were lovely storytelling touches, those fictionalizing techniques that Sarah talked about, and I laughed at Mark's flashes of dark humor. You have to read the book to get it. You know, the Cabrini biographer, the gigolo factor, the David Jones and husbands line, sorted throughout the narrative. In Mark, I had the privilege and absolute pleasure of working with a brilliant author who understood narrative. More than that, he had the ability and the stamina to work and rework a piece of writing until it achieved the effect that he was after. He was self-reflexive enough to write in response to an editorial query, for instance, and I quote, "I think I'm going to have another shot at eliminating some of the backstory. It still feels a little flat to me in parts. I reread it today and it came up with some thoughts that might help. Don't want this to be boring, so snip away." Mark had no issue with killing darlings. Mark's superpower, as you all know, was his way with words. 30 Days is the result of his attempt to bring Karen to life and back to life through his power with words and his abiding belief in the magic of the abracadabra kind. He failed, But clever, playful, mourning, blasphemous Mark anticipated that and put all that in play in his narrative by challenging even sacred ideas, and consider this a language warning. Quote, "A broken ladder will collapse, just as a metastasized cancer will spread, just as a drunken driver crossing the border between Poland and Germany will crash a car and kill my grandmother, just as a murderer with evil intentions will kill an entire village. So all that is left to do is pray from the deepest seat of our souls and cry out the holiest of words. Fuck." "My words would keep Karen alive, weave a protective web of stories around my wife," he wrote on page 91. He maintained that link between narrative and life as a true line in the book because, as he saw it, despite the randomness of events, history does call back on itself, highlighting how even our unscripted lives carry stories with narrative coherence. Per the abracadabras, he foregrounds all this to remind us that any work of writing is necessarily an artifice, a construction, even a work that is called nonfiction. Karen has a voice in the book, but her voice, indeed the representation of her life, is Mark's creation and a giant act of ventriloquism on his part to understand who she was, who he was, who they were, and to capture, all he could from Karen, who was archivist of their shared history. She was their memory. Mark may have been the writer, but Karen's biographer is in no way spared in the book. When discussing if he was going to write about her after she died, book Karen gives it to Mark straight up. Quote, "I'm your best subject since your mother. Everyone loves a story about death." I really, really, really hope she said that to him in that way. What everyone loves more than a story about death is a story about love, a story about the grace to acknowledge a good life led, and a story about dying with grace, which is what 30 Days is. The other things we dealt with in the manuscript was standard editorial gardening, losing some of the granular detail by meshing together some chapters to speed things up, telling the story of the fractured family and the child caught in between without crowding it with too much extraneous detail, quoting only selectively from Mark and Karen's love letters so they were shorter and so that readers didn't feel like they were prying when they were reading them. I felt I was prying. Actually, when I read them, I kind of thought, maybe we can pull some of this back. What do you think? Splitting some chapters. I asked a lot of dumb questions, things like, how okay is it to liken illness with the Holocaust, Professor of Jewish Studies? I am obsessed with endings, and we thought long and hard about where the narrative ended, a question that would endure to the final pages when the book was way out of my hands. The title too, we changed that from the original title, from the manuscript that he sent me. So back and forth we went with the aim of having as polished a piece of writing as we could muster for submission to Mark's agent and via his agent to publishers. I always tell my authors to bring their work to the defensible stage. That way, any and all feedback that first readers offer will help you stress test and develop the narrative. If you, as the author, know the effect you're striving for, all editorial suggestions and critique can only help you get to where you want to go and sharpen the overall narrative. If you know what you want, you can also consciously unlisten or push back to the editor as well too, so it goes both ways. At this stage, I was an unaffiliated freelancer and have always worked with an eye to knowing that the publisher who bought the manuscript would have his or her vision for it. This meant the manuscript had to be good enough to be picked up, but not be so hermetically sealed that there didn't exist the capacity for further editorial dialogue or to be tweaked so that the book best met the market the publisher was wanting to reach. Finally, Mark felt ready to show the book to his agent. His first book, The 50th Gate, was agented by Jill Hickson, and when she retired, she sold her business. So Mark had a new agent. 50th Gate, as we all know, had been a bestseller, had sold nearly 100,000 copies, and also a prize winner. So you think a new book by the same author will be a cause for celebration. Things were not so straightforward. It had been 2 decades between books for Mark, which meant that to an extent he was actually almost starting again. And much as the agent thought well of the manuscript, She also said that it was a personal piece that was a big challenge for the mainstream market, so she wouldn't represent him on the manuscript. We had failed at the very first hurdle. It was devastating. I felt terrible that I had let Mark down. Rejections of your professional acumen go to the heart of your sense of self. And we held on quite tightly to our judgment. All of us do, I guess, to an extent. I know the capriciousness of the business and how it works, and my disappointment was quickly replaced by indignation, fortunately. So I made it my mission to send the book out to a few very select publishers on Mark's behalf, who was, by now, a little bit nervous. Fortunately, we received 2 offers of publication, both hugely enthusiastic and who got the intent of the book, with one saying, and I quote, "Mark, I have to tell you, it was that rare and wonderful thing, an acquisitions meeting where everyone around the table just got the book immediately and loved it. There were even some tears as people spoke about how moved they felt by their reading of 30 Days. I have to actually underline the rare and wonderful thing where everyone around the table agrees on the book unanimously. That happens far less frequently than you would think, I have to say, in a publisher's boardroom. With 2 offers, you think we'd have an ecstatic Mark. But a stratospheric viral load, courtesy of a mosquito in Ubud, had given him dengue fever that put him in hospital. He was also slightly shaken by the agent's response and had a bad gut and was understandably unsure about how to evaluate who he was to go with. Does he follow his head? Does he follow his heart? I suggested he trust his instinct to also check his book and to also check his bookshelves. Which of the 2 publishers' books appeared more? That might help him choose. You know how this story ends. He went with Michael Hayward and Penny Houston at Text Publishing. He liked that Text are a literary imprint and that they were happy to retrieve the rights to 50th Gate and issue a new edition. His email from that time gives you an idea of the mulling. Quote, "What's your gut tell you? It's healthier than mine and more experience. I know you don't want to say, but I trust you. Did you know people outside lit circles haven't heard of Text? Doesn't matter, just saying." Every book needs its barakers inside and outside a publishing house. And he had found his people in Michael and Penny. On Karen's birthday, he said yes and found himself a home for 30 and 50, as we took to calling it. He celebrated in characteristic Mark fashion, writing to me, quote, "I can't think of a nicer way of hiding and coping." And that actually sent me back to this paper sent me back to the dates as well too. And I was actually surprised when looking through our correspondence that only 2 months had elapsed between when we first met and the submission. So we had both just gone like the clappers to just get this out sooner rather than later. And I'm really glad we did. Publishing is based on relationships and connections. No one publisher can publish everyone, but there is likely a right publisher for you and your work. You have to trust the person who is going to have carriage of your precious book. In an ideal world, this person, like Joan Didion's editor, Henry Robbins, will give you a sense of yourself to sit down and do the work required, and will have your back through the covers, the strap lines, the last chapters, the potential blurbers, all those kinds of things that happen during the production of a book. It has been one of the great privileges of my professional life to help Mark bring 30 Days to life. His attempt to think through the paradox of writing about the afterlife of love. As he said in the 50th Gate, only a broken heart yearns to heal the world. Some of us will always stay behind. Fortunately, we have memory, and as long as that endures, we have story. Thank you.
Thanks, Foong Ling. I think we don't often think about the relationship between a writer and an editor, and not only how important it is for the text, but also just how beautiful that relationship is as an interpersonal relationship.
It is,
and the role an editor plays in bringing it to fruition. So thank you for that. I also just want to point out, like Mark wrote 30 Days, like at lightning speed. My father passed away just a couple of months before Karen, and I wrote a book about him that took me about 4 years. So I can really appreciate the just absolute speed with which he did that. Our next speaker is, we all know Arnold Zable, one of Australia's most acclaimed writers, and Arnold said to me yesterday I can introduce him however I want. So probably Australia's best known Collingwood supporter, which I think he shares with Mark, right? Was Mark a Collingwood supporter? Ish? Okay. Oh God. I remember we talked about it. But we all know Arnold through his many novels, Jewels and Ashes, Café Scheherazade, The Fig Tree, Scraps of Heaven, Sea of Many Returns, Violin Lessons, The Fighter, The Watermill, and the forthcoming The Glass Horse of Venice. It's a sort of literary legacy that's pretty much unmatched. And I'm lucky enough to have known Arnold all my life. He grew up on the same street as my father, and they were very close friends. So I'm really honoured to be able to introduce you. Arnold's going to talk about the different Jewish environments in which he and Mark grew up and the kind of contrast between those Jewish Melbournes.
I'd like to acknowledge Ray and Michelle. Can you hear? Oh, gee, now it's pointing up. I just wanted to acknowledge Michelle and Genya and Mark's beautiful children and Ray. And actually, when Ray asked me to take part in this tribute to Mark, I felt honoured, but I hesitated. After discussing it, we agreed there was one specific perspective I could bring to the conversation. For want of a better name, I'm going to explore the contrast between our upbringings as Carlton boy and Caulfield boy, as a means of tracing the evolution of Mark's all-embracing sense of being in the world. First, the context, and through it, a reflection on what Mark and I shared in common before speculating on the differences. How do we measure a generation? 20 years is the biological norm, more or less, but perhaps there are other ways of measuring it. After many years of reflecting on the experiences of Holocaust survivors and asylum seekers and many other people, I've come to see that their life journey can be viewed as a 3-act drama, 3 distinct periods, indeed 3 generations concentrated within one lifetime. Act 1, the time before, life vor der Milchome, before the war. Once I had a home, an extended family, a connection to another place, another community. For my parents, it was the Stettlach of the Polish-Russian borderlands. For Mark's mother, Genya, it was a rural settlement in present-day Ukraine. And for his father, Yosel, a village in southwestern Poland. Act 2, the rupture, lives overturned, dispossession, flight, a Shoah, and annihilation. There are countless scenarios. Act 3, the time after, Nach der Milchome, emigration, putting down roots elsewhere, the roller coaster of rebuilding, the elation of new birth. Again, there are many scenarios. Both Mark and I had parents whose lives can be viewed in this way, and both of us have explored the phases of their lives in all their fullness as writers, educators, travellers, historians, and above all, as sons. And both of us embarked on journeys to the time before Act 1, the sites of our parents' childhood and youth. And we both returned with the maps of their early years, the neighbourhoods, the streets they once inhabited. We were both passionately engaged in a similar mission to restore the missing link in the ancestral chain. But while Mark and I were of the second generation, as it is often characterised, and while we were born just 12 years apart, I in 1947 and Mark in 1959, in another sense, we belong to different generations. I was born in the immediate post-war years. The grief of my parents and their generation was very recent. Their focus, as I mentioned, was to make a new life. They settled in Carlton. Our parents were so preoccupied making ends meet, we, their children, had a lot of freedom. We were the children of post-war immigrants pouring in from Eastern Europe, Italy, Greece, the Baltic states, Yugoslavia, living side by side with the children of working-class Aussie neighbours, many of whom had lived there for generations. We enjoyed a rich street life with all its harmonies and conflicts. We, by necessity, became streetwise. We attended local state schools. There were no Jewish day schools back then. Our Jewish education took place on the weekends in the secular E.L. Parrott Yiddish school, the Bialik Hebrew school, Talmud Torah for the Orthodox. All three schools were incidentally located within the same couple of blocks in Drummond Street. There were other suburbs where post-war survivors began life anew. St Kilda, for instance, but most lived in the northern suburbs in rented houses close to the factories and inner city, places of work. There was a distinct class divide between North Side and South Side. The divide is often overlooked, underplayed, romanticised or forgotten. The awareness of class difference was far more acute back then. In the early 1950s, Shaw and Davey, two bureaucrats from the Housing Commission, made their way by car through the streets of Carlton. They recommended a massive slum clearance program. Vast swathes of Carlton, the houses we lived in, were to be demolished and replaced by high-rise public housing estates. It is said they didn't even get out of their car, hence their review was popularly called the Windshield Report. It triggered a residents' action movement that in large part successfully opposed the plan and preserved what is now ironically expensive gentrified housing stock. By the time Mark was born, the demographics were changing. Immigrant Jewish families were becoming more established, moving to the eastern and southern suburbs. Yossel and his brother Baruch had established a successful business. The Baker family was well on the way to affluence. Unlike his brother John, born 5 years earlier, Mark experienced, as he himself has said, a more quote-unquote sheltered childhood. The Sunday schools were being transformed into Jewish day schools. Mark attended Mount Scopus, formed a deep attachment to Zionism. He experienced life within Shtetl Caulfield. Much more can be said about these contrasting worlds. The point I wish to make is that while Mark may have had a more quote-unquote sheltered childhood, he burst out of the bubble. It was a journey that began in early adulthood, propelled by Mark's intellectual passions, especially his interest in history, which took him to Melbourne University, Oxford, Jerusalem, many places, physically, intellectually. The Mark Baker I knew was driven by a hunger for both knowledge and experience, underpinned by a sharp intellect. He was a seeker. He explored many ways of being, both in the Jewish world and the world at large. In 1995, Mark called me to discuss a generation project, a night of Yiddish cabaret. Typically, he wanted to translate his curiosity into tachlis, practical outcomes. Typically, he handed the reins to a huge production team, and that included many young volunteers. In the program, you can see them named as the waiters. And typically, he wanted the audience to be both entertained and intellectually enriched. So he got me to write an extensive program essay on the history of Yiddish theatre, both in Australia and at large. And we had many discussions about this before I went ahead and wrote it. Mark was always quick on the uptake. He moved into new worlds with inquisitive ease. It was never merely academic. He entered into the spirit of things. In the Yiddish Cabaret project, he felt totally at home in a progressive, secular, Yiddishist world. While remaining a committed Zionist, Mark also began to ask questions. Michelle Lesh traces this shift to the time of the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. Mark entered into public conversations with Palestinians. The students he took on study tours of Israel also visited Palestine and listened to speakers presenting the Palestinian view. Mark exposed himself and his students to contending narratives. It took immense courage. Mark also explored and introduced his students to other genocides, took them to Rwanda and South Africa, as well as to Eastern Europe. Mark Baker may have begun as a Caulfield boy, but he became a citizen of a wider world. While he remained deeply rooted in his Jewish past and its traditions, he was driven to create meaningful ways of expressing these traditions in a contemporary context. He was also driven to explore that which unites us both within and beyond our tribal loyalties, a common humanity. Life is full of paradox. Michelle has told me that in his final memoir, which we're going to hear about soon, Mark writes of finally moving beyond Stadtl Caulfield. But geographically, he didn't move far. He lived his final years in St Kilda in an apartment with a view of Luna Park. As a child, coincidentally, I saw that gaping clown entrance as the mouth of the world. Perhaps this is where Mark's story culminates, and in a sense, where it begins anew in the legacies that he bequeathed future generations. The final page, I just saw it, found it the other day, the final page of the Yiddish cabaret program is devoted to one line from the Psalms, quote, that the generation to come might know, unquote. In this, despite leaving us all too soon, Mark fulfilled his immense promise. Thank you.
So we're going to do a quick changeover. So I'll ask our current speakers to come down and maybe someone can swap your lapel mic. And while we do the changeover, I just want to quickly reflect on something Arnold was saying about Mark's teaching, because this sort of future legacy is really important. And as Mark's successor at the ACJC, I see directly the ways in which his teaching and his approach to teaching shaped a generation of people who came through our programs. And when I taught with him, when he taught the Arab-Israeli conflict, just as Arnold said, he saw it as really important to show that what was at the core of the conflict was conflicting narratives, a conflicting understanding of where things began and why they happened. And he always tried to find some kind of ground for, common understanding within those narratives. Do you want to come up, Michelle, as well? Yeah. So, that was generations of students who had the privilege not only of sitting in Mark's classrooms, but also travelling the world with him and experiencing on the ground really Mark's passion and drive. Okay. So, what we're going to hear now is about the new book that's coming out. So I'll leave it to our speakers. But first among them is, again, one of the sort of intellectual giants of Australia, Raimond Gaita, who is Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at King's College London and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. The University of Antwerp awarded him the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa, quote, for his exceptional contribution to contemporary moral philosophy and for his singular contribution to the role of the intellectual in today's academic world. His books include Good and Evil, An Absolute Conception, Romulus, My Father, which was made into a feature film, A Common Humanity, Thinking About Love and Truth and Justice, The Philosopher's Dog. After Romulus, as editor with Jerry Simpson, Who's Afraid of International Law, and most recently edited by Scott Stevens, Justice and Hope, Essays, Lectures and Other Writings. And I really want to thank Ray as well for being really the driver behind this session. You know, we talked early on about how we could honour Mark and his extraordinary contribution to Australian Jewish culture and literature and to Australian culture more broadly. So thank you so much, Ray, for making this all happen.
And I want to thank Dave. Can you hear me? Okay. And Debbie for having made this possible, and of course for Michelle. When Michelle and I first planned this event, I thought I'd talk about Mark as I knew him. But our friendship and our political beliefs were so entwined, I couldn't talk of one without talking of the other. He was, as you will know, outspoken and, as Arnold brought out so well, very courageous in the expression of his beliefs, which were often dissenting. But I think today is not an occasion to discuss them. I therefore decided instead to make some brief comments about truth and narrative as it bears on a season of death. I hope you'll forgive me for being a bit philosophical. I can't help it, I'm a philosopher. But I'll try to be brief, because Michelle is the person you really must hear. Mark began to write what became A Season of Death in hospital on the day he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Michelle will tell you the story of it. It's sufficient for me to say that he entrusted the preparation of the manuscript for its publication to her and to me. And later I'll read from it, and so will Michelle. We have only one copy of the book, which we'll share, although actually I've got the stuff written here, so. But I want to hold it up. Because after working on the manuscript for almost a year, the existence of this book as a physical object is a joy to us to hold in our hands. It's precious to us, and we thank from the bottom of our hearts Foong Ling. On the title page of the last draft of the manuscript, I wrote, "One day, Melilla will read this book, and she will ask her mother," for anybody who doesn't know, Melilla is the daughter of Michelle and Mark, a miracle child. "One day, Melilla will read this book, and she'll ask her mother, is it true? Was he really like that? Were you really like that? Was your love for him and his for you as he wrote it to be?" I intended to speak those words to Mark. It didn't happen. He died sooner than anyone expected. I didn't intend to raise the question of truth and implicitly truthfulness because I didn't believe what he'd written. I wanted to draw his attention to passages in which he expressed skepticism about the very possibility of truth in biographical and autobiographical writing. You'll be familiar with the observation that if you ask 7 people to tell you tell you about someone they knew, you'll get 7 different stories. Well, that's, of course, undeniable, but it's not inconsistent with agreement after perhaps long discussion on what a person was really like. But that, however, is not why people make that observation, especially at writers' festivals. Peter Gay says in his biography of Freud that Freud wrote to Stefan Zweig saying, I quote, "Whoever turns biographer commits himself to lies, to concealment, to hypocrisy, to embellishments, and even to dissembling his own lack of understanding, for biographical truth is not to be had," end of quote. That's not Freud at his most subtle. But the statement that biographical truth is not to be had can be developed in 2 different directions. The first direction accepts that there is a truth to be had, but emphasises the difficulty of getting it for reasons that are well known and which focus for the most part on our humanly deep inclination to believe what we wish to believe rather than what is true. Human beings cannot take much reality, observed T.S. Eliot. Perhaps Freud thought that narrative, or biographical and autobiographical narrative, could never overcome our readiness to live a lie, that only psychotherapy of a kind informed by depth psychology could do it. Development of the second kind of reading of Freud, however, takes us to a more radical place, indeed to a conceptual domain of a different kind. The first is psychological. The second might be called metaphysical. It claims that there's nothing in this world that counts as what someone really is like, and it would therefore be foolish for Melilla to ask what her father, Mark Baker, was really like. The first says you can try for truth, but probably won't get it. The second says there's nothing to try for. Obviously, none of this stopped Gay from writing Freud's biography. Mark was sometimes given to professing the second kind, a radical kind of scepticism. I say professing because it is, of course, at bottom a form of nihilism, and nobody who knew Mark, profoundly idealistic, committed to justice, in love with the world, could think of him as nihilistic. But writers are sometimes attracted to words that are, as we put it, justifiably unkindly, mere words, just talk. When he lived his dying, Mark resisted what he believed to be false consolation, knowing that natural, almost irresistible though it is to seek it, it's a betrayal of one's humanity. Even then, had I told him that I'd just read a biography whose untruthfulness was apparent to all but its authors, he might have responded by asking, "And what do you think, Ray, truth comes to in this kind of writing?" But if I'd had the opportunity to explain what I'd written on that title page of the manuscript, why I thought it important to tell him, I'm certain he would have looked me in the eyes, fully appreciating the gravity of what's at issue, and said, in effect, "I know Melilla will ask this. I'll do all I can to enable Michelle to reply truthfully, yes." That certainty gave Michelle and me the confidence to alter some passages in order to attenuate as much as possible any radical sceptical resonances. I'd intended to read passages from the draft and from the published book, comparing them so that you could see what we did and why we did it. But there's no time for that. But later, when I read a little bit from the book, and when Michelle does, you'll see if you can spot our interventions. A Season of Death is a love story, a love of Michelle, Melilla, and differently, his parents, Yossel and Genya. It's also a story of grief. In much of my work, I've drawn attention to how fundamental to the very concepts that define the inner life, the life of the heart and of the soul, is the distinction between their real and their counterfeit forms. The examples of central importance to Mark's book are those of real love and real grief, as they must be distinguished from infatuation, from needy self-interested attachment, from mordant self-pity, for example. The effort to attend to the independent reality of another person is essential to them all. And that's one reason why truth is a need of the soul. Mark writes, and I quote, "That's what Melilla will be, an archaeologist forever digging deeper and deeper into the hole inside her in the hope of finding what lies at the bottom of it. Or will her mother and siblings and my grandchildren be able to uncover forgotten memories? I imagine them sitting around a table or on a holiday laughing about a story that concerns me. They take it in turns, filling the gaps." End of quote. I wanted to tell Mark that I wrote what I did on the title page of the manuscript because I wanted to tell him that he must do all he can to ensure that when Melilla continues digging after she's read A Season of Death, the book will help her to distinguish the fantasies that she placed in that hole, all the many beliefs she placed in it, wishing them to be true but when they weren't. Distinguishing all that from what is true and can therefore be healing for her because it's genuinely food for her soul. She must have no doubt, therefore, that there is truth to be found and that if she finds it, she'll find her father. Yesterday, I watched a restored version of the film Ron Was My Father at the Melbourne International Film Festival. Between me and my life as I've lived it, there stands a memoir, a long biographical essay on my mother, and a film. This can be unnerving in only the way the fear of a loss of contact with reality can be. Michelle will read A Season of Death many times in the coming years. I'm pretty sure she'll be unnerved, just as I have been. She'll need to trust that the book can anchor her to the truth of her life when she was young, in love, married, and gave birth to their miracle baby. In one of the most important passages in A Season of Death, Mark writes, and I quote, "As I stare into the wilderness of knowing and not knowing my future in the home that Michelle has made for me and Melilla, my focus is on injecting as much of me as I can into the people I love. All that matters is staring into the sum total of my life and reconciling myself to its blessings and flaws. Now is not the time to belatedly try to fit in all of the things I always wanted to do, as if in the 11th hour you can define who you are and the life you have lived. My struggle now is to get out of bed and to play with Melilla, or to see my grandchildren and walk down the street with them. I barely recognize my disfigured body. I've shaved my hair, lost my muscle weight, lightened my olive skin. Who am I? It leaves me wondering about the question posed by Rab Zusha. Have I been Mark Baker, truthfully, authentically myself, true to myself? I don't even know how to construct a narrative of my life outside of the bits and pieces of my years." End of quote. Well, obviously, you can't try to be authentically yourself if you believe there's no such thing as who you really are, or if you don't care if you're living a lie about who you are. Martin Buber, the great Jewish religious philosopher, whom I'm glad Sarah mentioned, tells us why this matters. I had planned to read the following quotations to Mark. In an essay titled Guilt and Guilt Feeling, Buber tells of a woman who had evaded her guilt and appeared to flourish socially. Yet, he says, quote, "The price paid for the annihilation of the sting was the final annihilation of the chance to become the being this created person was destined to become through her highest disposition." He goes on, "Essence, by this I mean that for which a person is peculiarly intended, what he is called to become." End of quote. That, of course, has a deeply religious ring to it. Mark had an ear for it, so he would not have minded. But the idea that one is under an ethical imperative to live one's life with clarity and lucidity about its meaning is as old as Socrates. He said at his trial under sentence of death that an unexamined life is not worthy of a human being. Elsewhere, I have written, as a gloss on the Socratic maximum, that our humanity is not something given to us once and for all, as membership of the species Homo sapiens is. Rather, it is something to which we are called upon to rise, a call that never ends, would never end, even if we were to live 1,000 years, as Mark appeared sometimes to hope he would. I believe that was what Mark was struggling for when he wrote what I quoted before, and achieved, actually, when he died. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. And we'll move to our final speaker before we hear a bit more from the book. Michelle Lesh is a senior fellow at Melbourne Law School. It sort of feels very clinical to read your bio, given your relationship to Mark. She worked at the United Nations as an international lawyer, and for many years in Israel as a legal advisor at governmental, intergovernmental and non-governmental levels. I'm going to say she's on a bunch of boards, writes a lot, and is the mother to Melilla and the wife to Mark. And just on a personal note, I've known Michelle as long as I've known Mark. You were in that sphere of people who disagreed with each other when he first came into my life. So I'm really, again, honoured to be introducing you.
Thanks, David. Thank you, David, for being part of making this happen, and Debbie and Melbourne Jewish Book Week, and the extraordinary panellists who, just went over and above what I could have imagined in how beautifully they honoured Mark. So thank you. I'm going to start by reading an excerpt from the memoir, A Season of Death, Mark's memoir. I am a dreamer, a Luftmensch, with my head in the clouds, antagonising powerful people with my political antics. Johnny, by contrast, always knew how to win over people. Perhaps these parallel and divergent paths are the deeper structures that make up my story. In authorial terms, they take on an omnipotence and a third person's perspective, for my role has not been forged by my own willful intentions. My mother is the main protagonist, pulling the strings that make up her son's psychological attributes, drawing two brothers into close but dueling protagonists. The fabulous Baker boys, we were called in an article in the Jewish press. For our last act, horrifically unpredictable but consistent with a pre-written script, our lives have merged. As in the beginning, I am following him to his grave. We have both been stricken by upper gastrointestinal cancers. We are dying at exactly the same age. When I hear myself laughing, I hear his voice. It is as though I have embodied his flesh. He has become my dibuk, the spirit that lies inside me, speaking through me, determining the length of my prognosis, two sons merging into one, over which my mother can no longer imagine a life beyond. How can I determine the truth of my story? I am like a book by William S. Burroughs. My life can be cut into pieces and assembled in different ways, or is like a pack of cards that I can see my father shuffling before randomly dealing them out. A full house looks different each time. There is no linear story or discrete chapters. There is no before or after. There is only the projection of what was and what might have been. Memory, fickle, pliant, circular, fragmentary. My beginning is my end, a child as an adult as a child, riding the circle game until I am gone, leaving the detritus of my life to be picked up and told and retold by those who summon my name. Dust to ashes, ashes to dust. This is why I have asked my family to etch a particular image onto my tombstone. It is the clock that sits on the belfry in the oldest synagogue in Prague, appropriately known as the Alt New Shul, the Old New Shul. The Hebrew letters from 1 to 12 mark out time. They have been inscribed backwards so that 1 o'clock is 11 o'clock, or perhaps because Hebrew script is written from right to left, the hands of time tick anti-clockwise. Even one verse in the Hebrew alphabet, the Prague clock is disorienting, Kafkaesque, even though it was installed 1,000 years before the birth of the modernist writer. My children have told me that they will also tattoo this image on their bodies after I have gone. Gaby's already done it. If my blood platelets weren't low, I would do the same now. The clock is ticking forwards and backwards. Soon time will stop for me, and the putrid water from which I was formed will merge with the worms and the maggots in my grave. I will be the one person at my burial who doesn't hear the thud of earth landing on the coffin, or note who was present and absent from the funeral of the late Mark Baker, to which he added the middle name Raphael from his oldest ancestor and the angel of healing. Who is Mark Raphael Baker? We entered our worst nightmare when Mark was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, terminal cancer. Our daughter Melilla was just shy of 8 months. A big auntie to twin nephews and a niece, babies all around us. We mistakenly thought that we were a family blossoming with happiness and regeneration. We had entered a stage that we naively hoped would be one of renewal and light after scars of death and illness had afflicted the Baker family. Karen, Johnny, Yossel, and Sylvia. It's impossible to explain the depths of sadness and shock of learning of and then trying to absorb Mark's diagnosis. A world shattered, a future disappearing before our eyes. The difficulty for the heart to carry such devastation makes one dizzy. The heart tempts the mind to devise methods of turning away in order to cope. There was black humour. There were fantasies of miracles. If anyone can defy the odds, it is Marky Baker and his uncanny ability to make life good. Everything he touches turns to gold, one obituary marvelled and lamented in one and the same breath. But these illusory thoughts were only fleeting reprieves from the unsettling darkness of a world closing in. Watching the person that I love the most dying before me, and the person that we created together will soon be robbed of knowing the love of her father. On Mark's first night in hospital, before the official diagnosis had been confirmed, but we knew that things were bad, very bad, Mark did two things. In a shared room, in a hospital that was all too familiar from the heartbreaking trajectories of Karen and Johnny's illnesses, he managed to cut through the fear and bewilderment of what he knew awaited him. He put on his headphones to listen to Bach, and he started typing his memoir on his laptop. It might sound romantic, perhaps even a touch pretentious. But it was not. He was terribly sick, in excruciating pain, overwhelmed by sadness. His instinctive response to his hellish new reality was, in its own quiet way, awe-inspiring. I often reflect upon how Mark managed to find within himself the strength, love, calm, and discipline to write. He was not tempted by alluring distractions and coping mechanisms that might assuage moment by moment the cruelty with which life now confronted him. It speaks to his enormous capacity and courage, capacity to create, to inspire, to connect, and to love. Courage to try and face death truthfully. In this act of writing at such a moment, he was so very Mark Baker. Even the tone in which he wrote about his first night in hospital evokes a mix of light and dark, humour and sober reflection, but never self-pity. And I'm quoting now from the memoir. I ended up in a double room with an old priest who farted all night. It didn't bother me. I had speakers covering my ears, channeling Bach, and I'd already cocooned myself in an alternative world conjured by Mozart's Requiem. Every day of his 13 months of illness, Mark wrote his memoir. No matter his fatigue or his pain or his weary spirits. In the middle of the night, when sleep escaped him because of the steroid medication from chemo or the pain from cancer, he opened his laptop to write. 4 days before he died, when he was in hospital and we were in our different ways preparing for his imminent yet incomprehensible death, he was writing emails thanking Anita Lester for her stunning cover for the memoir and putting feelers out to secure a publisher. He gave our personal tragedy a touch of gold by writing this memoir. The beauty of his writing, which moves between and often within the lyrical and poetic, the heartfelt and the open, the honest and the devastatingly real, the philosophical and religious, the sadness and grief, and the comedic and self-deprecating. Always, always full of love. Love of the world, love of life, and most importantly, love of his family, his 4 children, his mother, and me. This was his gift to us. My year of Avelut, mourning, was spent working on Mark's memoir with Ray, another gift he gave me. The process was at times addictive. I could hear his voice. I could be close to him. It was as though he was still here with me. Yet he was describing his dying. I know how the story ends. I am living it. But being in it through his words was a form of escape from the world in which he is no longer. Our almost 3-year-old daughter talks about her dada every single day. She longs for him, she cries for him, she misses him. she has strong and vivid memories of him. She knows Dada died, but the mystery of death has a prescience when it comes in the form of questions from an innocent toddler trying desperately to grapple with the unthinkable. Why did Dada die? Why did his body stop working? Why didn't he take his phone with him when he died?
Yeah.
I want to send a video to where Dada died. I want my Dada. Did he go on a holiday when he died? When is he going to stop dying? I want to die so I can be with Dada. The depths of her aching pain that spill out from moments of utter joy and delight and happiness is excruciating and surreal. I find comfort in two precious gifts that he gave me, a beautiful daughter and the memoir through which she will come to know her father and his love for her. I'm going to now read for you another a shorter extract from the memoir. What will be the last word that I will hear? Mama, Dada? There is a time for everything, a time for life and nurturing. Ours has been a season of death, punctuated by glimpses of profound fecundity. A family whose head and soul has been lacerated. The Becker machine and Krochmal clan from Poland and Ukraine. If I could film the last 7 years of my life, I would call it 4 funerals and a wedding. My marriage to Michelle has transcended all of these deaths, stood outside of them, but was also framed by them through an act of pure love. Love of Michelle and of the baby we created, a love which will soon be snatched from us by a 5th funeral. Who will narrate this new script after I am gone? I wonder how long before Malila will realise Dada isn't in the bedroom and call out for Mama only, and experiment with ways to tell the story of her missing father. Mama, Dada, 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 Mama, Mama, once upon a time.
Okay, so I think we could all use a stiff drink now. I want to thank everyone for coming and sticking with us right to the end. I think we could go another hour and all go through another box of Kleenex. So thanks for sharing that with us. Thanks to our wonderful panellists who shed so much light on Mark's life and work. Thanks to Mark's family for allowing him to shape all our lives so profoundly and giving that gift to us. And yes, thanks for coming again on behalf of Melbourne Jewish Book Week and the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization. Thanks.